So, Professor Mooney, you had never seen this film before, as we noted. Mm-hmm. And Andrew, I don't think you made it as a work of exact historical sticklership.
No, I'm not offended at any reaction you have.
But I would love to hear your first impressions of this as being someone who's so learned in the area.
Yeah, no, so there was definitely some, reasonable technological terminology in there. I wouldn't have used depth first search in any sense in this, but yeah, no, so you definitely got a feel for the time. And again, I was, sort of in, this is 1980, is that when it's?
It's kind of vaguely somewhere on the cusp
That's actually when I started college. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you were sort of doing this, how many other people did you know who were also doing this, and were there get-togethers, were there conferences?
Oh, yes. So, usually the birth of AI is deemed 1956. It was the first meeting held at Dartmouth. The term was founded by John McCarthy, who was a professor at Dartmouth at the time, moved shortly thereafter to MIT. And so by the time I started, graduate school in 1983, it was a pretty established, part of computer science. And so I went to my first AI conference, somewhat surprisingly. I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois. I came here to Austin in 1984 to AAAI, it was then the American Association for Artificial Intelligence. Now they got rid of they changed the American to Advancement, Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. But yeah, no, by the early 80s, it was, AI was an established scientific discipline within computer science.
And obviously chess in this is a means to an end to get all these smart people sort of working on projects that they can have an end result that everyone can kind of understand, the layperson can understand. What were some of the exercises that were undertaken? Because now, obviously, AI rewrites, instruction manuals in the style of Shakespeare, and we're all very impressed. But what were the sort of applications that AI were put through in those days?
Yeah, so game playing always was. I think it was maybe Alan Turing in his original paper about AI that maybe proposed, chess as an obvious problem. But I assume a lot of people have heard of the Turing test, right? Which is you have a conversation in a natural language like English with a computer, and can you distinguish a computer from talking to another person? And so that still, I think is a reasonable still test that people strive for, and was always on the agenda. But certainly game playing was always there, but particularly in the early to mid 80s, there was a lot of work on what were called expert systems, which is trying to get programs to solve particular problems that expert would solve, the classic one being like medical diagnosis, right? So systems were built that were shown to be better at like diagnosing certain types of bacterial infections better than doctors were, and those were, so there was always like scientific, medical types applications, but yeah, game playing, language, all sorts of things people have been working on, even starting from 1956.
Mm-hmm. And Andrew, so when you were making this film, I know you were consulting with Kevin, who was, playing a part in the film. Wiley Wiggins was already doing some stuff like that, and he's in the film. And were you consulting with others in addition to those actors? You have to know a bit about
a lot of the, most, I was trying to, because so this is the only movie I've ever done without a conventional screenplay. I had a treatment. We fleshed out the treatment a lot. We discussed everything, but ultimately I realized it was going to make a lot more sense for me to talk to people who could speak this language than to spend my time on Wikipedia trying to put all the words in their mouths. So Gordon Kindleman, who plays Professor Chesser, is a computer science professor at the University of Chicago now. James Curry, who will be here for the screening on Sunday, is he who plays Carberry, the British programmer. He's also a pretty serious commercial programmer. So a lot of those people on screen, a lot of the people who you see speaking programming language understand what they're saying in a way that I don't. But where I could go to them as the writer and kind of explain the mechanics of the scene and say, these are the kind of issues we're running into. This is what. So you tell me. And then we also had a great, I think who will also be here at the Sunday screening, a guy named Peter Kapler designed our chess games for us. So I could draw on his knowledge and say, I need the program to play disastrously in this kind of way, and you make me a game that makes sense for that. And that was so much fun to have him bring all that. But we just had an extraordinary group of oddballs all around us.
Bob Sabiston, of course.
Bob Sabiston, yes, who plays the leader of Kevin's team, the MIT team. He's a great local programmer and the guy who created the animation program used in Waking Life that's influenced a lot of animation.
I spent
programs
half the
since.
production picking his brain. He's a very brilliant man.
Yeah.
Yeah, it changed America, changed world animation in a lot of ways with the program that he developed. So it was a confluence of a lot of really interesting minds. So do you remember any, Kevin, being one of those people who kind of knew his way around? Do you remember any points when you were kind of like, no, that wouldn't happen, this would happen, anything like that?
I mean, I was frankly, as I said, people like Bob frankly knew more than me, so I was mostly picking their brain. I mean, the closest I've ever come to that was at one point in college, I had to write some AIs to play Othello, and interestingly enough,
The game of
yes,
play.
yes, yes. Important distinction. But one of the funny things was that there were sort of these three difficulty tiers that the Caltech professors, I'm a Caltech graduate, who wrote, and you had to try to beat all of them. And I was ultimately able to beat all three of them. I actually found the hard one the easiest to beat, ironically, because unlike the easier ones that played somewhat randomly stochastically, the hard one, while it was very good, played deterministically. So all you had to do was figure out one strategy that would beat it, and you'd win 100% of the time.
And that's one thing that I've noticed as we've all been going through an alarming period where we all worry that AI is going to become so extraordinarily powerful that it's going to take over the universe. There's been a lot of alarmism about it because AI has become a pretty good writer of, basic prose. Should we, Dr. Mooney, be that alarmed that AI is going to overreach its boundaries or become the tool that the slave that enslaves the master?
Yeah, no. So I think it's been amazing progress in the last few years. I've even been surprised, and I'm a very, when you work in the field for so long, you learn to be skeptical because people will claim things that are beyond what the program's capable of. But I am seriously impressed by the current systems like ChatGPT, and GPT-4 was literally just released last week, which is OpenAI's latest system. But they still have limitations. So one thing, I could give my standard academic lectures, but one thing we've tested recently is these systems' ability to answer why questions about short little stories. So they're very good at like who, what, where, when. But if you ask, why did some character do some action in a short little story, just like 5-sentence story, it frequently does very well, but sometimes it just totally fails and produces an answer for why someone did something that makes no sense at all. So one of the lines I've been using recently is these large language models, this current wave of technology, sometimes surprises you how smart they are. Sometimes they surprise you how stupid they are because they still will make completely ridiculous mistakes that a person would never make. Now, the percentage of times they do that is getting very, very small, but you always want to realize there are limitations. These things are not human equivalent. They haven't passed the Turing test by any reasonable definition that I would say. And there's still limitations and there's still progress to be made. But the recent progress has been astounding and is going to change the world, I think, even despite these limitations.
With self-driving, and not just the ability to generate volumes of prose, but with machines that operate themselves and so forth, yes?
But I think people have been disappointed in the progress in automated vehicles, right? Because a lot of it is this 90-10 rule or whatever. You can get 90% of the way there, but then getting that last bit where you can really trust a vehicle in unusual circumstances. I was just driving to Palmetto State Park, I don't know, but there were several ways where the road that Google told me to go through was blocked. And Google just got confused. It just sent me from one blocked road to another. And I had to figure out, go beyond the program and use my own human intelligence. Like, I got to go down another block to get to a road that will cross this railroad track. And so still, there are things where, I wouldn't trust an automated vehicle in arbitrary situations. I think we'll eventually get there. But getting that last bit of performance is always the hard thing.
When you say we're not there yet, do we have any means of kind of determining some estimated time frame with which we will reach that last 10%, or is there no formula for
I think
that?
the good thing for AI people is not to make these predictions. So people made these predictions in the 60s,
But it makes so much news when you do that.
So yeah, I'm always reluctant to do that. But yeah, I think the current technology can support an amazing variety of applications. And I think as long as we realize its limitations and don't just assume that the computer's going to do everything, but we use it as a tool. So say you're even a playwright or something. Maybe you want to ask ChatGPT, well, generate a sample little dialogue about such and such, and then you can look at it with a critical eye and then maybe make additions to it that only a human can bring to it. So I am, like a lot of AI people, I think a believer in not in generating machines that take over the world, but making tools for people that they can use that complement human intelligence in a way that makes their productivity better.
Let's ask the guy who does actually write page after page of dialogue between different characters. What do you think of that?
I wonder. I mean, it's hard not for me with my layman brain to want to extrapolate. Just having some sense. I'm certainly not an expert, but some sense of the history of chess after the period we put on display here, where it's still very much an open question. I think at this point, will the computer ever play at the highest human level? 1997 was when Deep Blue beat Kasparov, and that was a huge moment in both in AI and in chess. And since then, like the programs have come along that make Deep Blue look amateur, that are playing at a level that's, I think, beyond really the human ability to even comprehend how good they are at chess. And that's where that's the thing that I it's hard not to think wouldn't everything go in that direction. And
one of the lessons I think that AI has learned is the problems that you think are hard are actually easy for a computer, and the problems that you think are easy for humans actually turn out to be extremely hard. And so chess, sure, people find it interesting and puzzling, but it's a finite set of rules. There's no uncertainty. It's deterministic. It's just a matter of searching the branches of possibilities deep enough, that and again, like you said in there, I don't know if I know the exact number that you quoted, but yeah, the number of games is huge. Any computer program is not literally searching the entire space, but it's searching a much, much, much larger fraction of it than any human player is. And so it is using brute force to a fair extent to do this. And that sort of brute force doesn't work in a lot of other problems, whether it's driving a car or writing a novel or play or a movie script.
I mean,
where that sort of, there isn't just a fixed set of rules and a finite set of possibilities where you can just sort of brute force it and do well.
That actually ties into, I'd been having conversations with people where, people, are seeing all the disruption this is causing, and I've even seen some people bemoaning like, well, why did you teach it to draw and not teach it to do like household chores? And one point I've tried to make to them is actually teaching it how to draw, even though we think of that as a harder, more creative task, is actually a much easier task, actually. It's a confined problem space. The real world is messy.
Kevin, can you think of a problem that, Kevin or Professor Mooney, can you think of a problem that we would think is fairly simple that an AI would have a difficult time solving?
My own experiments with ChatGPT, I think elucidate certain things that it's very smart because it just has a lot of information, but it does seem to struggle when it's sort of trying to actually often analyze the whys behind, So I've quizzed it on certain ethical questions, for instance, which it often seems to struggle with. I was asking ChatGPT, okay, what are we ethically allowed to do to say stop climate change? And I was trying to figure out what it thought was permissible, and I basically was able to tease out of it that it told me, well, if you were going to do a protest and block traffic, that was ethical, but if you were going to say vandalize a famous artwork, as got a lot of publicity recently, not ethical. But then I was like, but wait a minute. What? Well, first of all, I was trying. So if you talk to ChatGPT, you probably learned this. It's very big on saying you must never break the law. That's one of OpenAI's safety constraints. But I pointed out, well, you are breaking the law when you block traffic. And then it's like, well, climate change is a really big emergency, so this is an exception. And then I was like, but why is it not okay to vandalize the paintings? And then I pointed out, and the vandalization of the paintings was done in a way where there was plexiglass, so no actual harm happened to the paintings. But on the other hand, you block traffic, somebody's trying to get to the hospital, they could die. And this broke its brain. It could not see the contradiction in its own ethical system, basically. But actually it behaved very human, where it was just kind of like, you're right, but I'm going to stick to my opinion. I'm not going to change my mind.
It's interesting that you say that there are certain boundaries sort of coded into ChatGPT. So Meaning that if you say, I want to go break the law, how can I best break into this bank vault or whatever, that it wouldn't do that?
Yeah, it won't answer that.
Or if I, how could I kill myself in this way? It probably won't answer. So how is that? It's probably the easiest thing in the world, right? Just watch for certain sets of words.
So they've added this thing called human feedback reinforcement learning. So they have had lots of people, give it feedback on all these things it shouldn't do. And so it's learning all that morality, not internally, but by having many, they don't release the numbers on this, of having people instruct it on when not to say things because it's a safety violation. So doesn't have its own internal moral reasoning. It's just been trained by people through many trials of what to avoid.
And even more on that end, I agree with Professor Mooney that, I'm not concerned with like really Skynet scenarios yet with this technology. I'm far more concerned with like people potentially misusing this technology. But even more than that, like, we've heard all these stories about like when people get it out of its ethical phase state and start getting it to behave immorally. It's even colloquially been termed Dan for do anything now when people trick it to be unethical. But one thing that's very interesting is people keep being like, wow, it keeps behaving just like AIs in fiction when I get into these places. And I'm like, of course it is, because it's been trained on us. Yeah. Like literally, it behaves like we have fantasized AIs might behave about. So the real irony is if like actually somehow it did go rogue and kill us, it might actually happen because we imagined that was a possibility actually.
One thing that I was talking to my doctor about AIs, and we had a long discussion about AIs, is because I was so healthy, what else was there to talk about? But he had said that one of the biggest problems that he faces is just his patients having seen some little bit of information on the internet, of course, and a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And now the cost of generating bullshit has basically gone to zero. Right. So not only can you just generate this bullshit article, this bullshit study, you can also generate any number of bullshit, footnotes and references, which could, in the hands of, people with bad actors, as we call them, could potentially generate a whole lot more misinformation and people feeling so committed to that misinformation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think generating terrible misinformation more easily is an issue. People always talk about deep fakes when you bring this up to generating fake videos that look like famous people doing crazy things, generating all sorts of misinformation, both text and visual and video. It's a serious problem. I think we're going to have to learn to be more skeptical about all sources of information, and because of this technology.
We're not great at this.
No.
We need to go to skeptic school, I think.
No, we're not. I mean, for a long time on the internet, it's been very popular. The internet is a wonderful sharing resource and has put a lot of historical academic information online. For a long time, people will on social media, they'll share this very interesting historical photograph they found. And every time I see people doing that these days, all I can think is, you just trust that's a real photo from the past. That could be fake and you don't even know it, but it pre-confirms your bias about the narrative of history. So you're just sharing it blindly, not going, wait a minute, how do I know this is real? I never heard of this until I saw the person posting it I just shared it from. We will have to be, I think, a lot more discerning going forward. But there are, and I'm sure Professor May can talk more about this, but there are certain technical measures even the builders of the AI can take. There's sort of a way you can actually, with systems like ChatGPT, almost add like a digital watermark to it, where what you do is, in the sort of token engine that tries to predict the next token, you can subtly bias it to pick not the word it would pick. You can sort of shift it to pick a slightly less probable word that'll still work. And if you do this over a long enough sentence, the odds that it was generated by a human versus the AI, you can run it through an analysis and it'll say like, oh, an AI definitely wrote this, even though it still looks like legit human text.
Know about this. It's actually my colleague at UT, Scott Aronson, that's working at OpenAI on this water
I just saw the
technology.
computer file video about it.
And so that's assuming that OpenAI that has written this program is willing to put that watermark into their system. If a rogue actor builds their own system, and again, it takes a fair bit of compute power to do that, but it's not infeasible for certainly a foreign government, or remain nameless, to build a system that doesn't have that watermarking, and then it's all off. That's relying on the fact that OpenAI is trying to be a good citizen and be ethical and be willing to watermark their their program, but someone else could easily generate an almost as good a model that's not watermarked, and now we can't detect it. Now, there are systems that try to detect this, and I think it's an arms race, right? The detectors for detecting, automatically generated content from real content, like fake images from real images, it's going to go back and forth, but it's going to get tougher and tougher and tougher to distinguish real photos from fake ones.
And I think, we're seeing AI arms races in all sorts of spaces. I was just reading about, there's a lot of artists who are very furious about AI generated art. So there's actually a research group I just read about that made an AI tool to essentially poison training set images such that it will blow up the AI algorithm and make it's called Glazer, I think, and it'll make it where the if art is taken non-consensually and added to the training set, it basically blows up the model. Wow. But then of course I just read about somebody just came up with a deglazer to counter that.
It's going to be a really interesting next 20, 30, 40 years, I think. I want to get some questions from the audience in just a moment. First of all, I did want to say that we're doing another screening on Sunday, which will be it'll be a much dopier, less smart screening, I think, because it'll be all about the movie.
Yeah.
And we'll have a number of the cast members. So I will ask if you have any questions for that, and you just want to show up for that Q&A at the end, just drop me a line, lars@austinfilm.org. You probably don't want to see computer chess twice in a row, but drop me a line, and I'll be sure that you can get into the Q&A for that if you want to ask questions about this. These are going to be the smart questions. So, but before I go to you guys, arms race. That phrase came up, and there's a big part of this film which is about these weird dudes from the Pentagon. Maybe? Who knows? And I was wondering, because we know clearly this happens, but I was wondering, Professor Mooney, did you see it? Were you ever courted by Pentagon people, anybody else like that?
Not directly, but it's certainly true that the Defense Department has funded a lot of AI research from the very beginning. Actually, I was a little skeptical when it was used DARPA. I said 1980, was it called DARPA? Because it was originally called ARPA. And actually, you were right.
Okay.
It converted in 1972, and then it converted back in the 90s. But ARPANET was the original, what was internet, was also funded by DoD. So a lot of computer science technology, particularly in the 60s, was funded through DoD, particularly through ARPA at the time. And but I was certainly never particularly approached. And I think, it's mainly funding basic research that's open, and I'm not saying the Defense Department doesn't have more classified programs that investigate AI, but most of the research is open, just the way the internet was, and eventually became public. So it makes a nice movie, issue, but I don't think I have never seen any the military trying to purposefully recruit AI people for nefarious purposes.
Back then, right now, they surely must be, right? That must be part of the cyber defense race, I assume. I don't know.
I mean, I can tell you that the U.S. Cyber Command is actually based here in Austin, Texas. I don't know much about what they do, but they're based right here.
In this room.
The agency that's always more secretive is usually called, sometimes people call it the no such agency, right? I assume people heard that one, the NSA.
Yeah. Well, it does introduce, for the purposes of the dramatic tone of the film, it introduces kind of an element of uncertainty and unease. And that guy's real creepy. The guy that you cast is that guy.
Who's talking about? Oh yeah, Jim Lewis, great novelist, local fella, brilliant guy. Yeah.
Yes. Let's go to the audience for a couple of questions here, if we have any great questions. And this could be about not just the film, but obviously about some of the issues. Right back here. Yeah.
How does society need to change to prepare for AI?
You said you're the ethics guy.
Well, I was just going to say, wow, you said we'd have the smart questions. I mean, wow, how does society have to change? I mean, it's a big, deep question. I think one thing we have to remember, first of all, is that, that we've created these systems, and any ethics they have are either inferred from the data we train them on or made a little more explicit by, as Professor Mooney was talking about, explicitly nudging its ethics in a certain direction. I think the thing we're going to have to resist is the idea that because these things seem so lifelike, so sentient, and so smart, we have to resist the temptation to think that just because it makes some moral pronouncement about how we should run some part of society, that we should just accept it. Already, AI are involved in a lot of areas that have very big implications for people's real lives. Already, AI systems are screening if people get certain jobs. They can be involved in parole decisions. If you include things like facial recognition under it, people have been wrongfully arrested because of mismatches with facial identification. And surprise, so many of these things, because we're training it on data from human society, and human society is biased, these systems are often very biased. In fact, there was a very famous ethical AI paper from probably the world's most famous ethical AI researcher, Mooney can tell me if I'm wrong, named Timnit Gebru, who used to be the head of Google's ethical artificial intelligence laboratory. She wrote a very famous paper in 2020 that actually led to Google dismissing her because they did not like some of what she was pointing out, called stochastic parrots. Stochastic is a fancy word for random, but she was basically pointing out, that these models are really very sophisticated statistical guessing engines. And there's a lot of danger in just blindly listening to the parrot, specifically around issues of, she pointed to that these models take immense amounts of energy to train, which can contribute to climate change. She pointed out that they display racial bias. She authored another famous paper pointing out that, facial recognition systems routinely identify people of color far less accurately than white people. They also misidentify women a lot more than men. And she also just, was pointing out that, that it's just very dangerous to, these are very sophisticated systems, but you can't think they're more than they are, basically. And that, she actually said there's almost a danger of when you have too much data, her whole point was that, like, the model, that you just gain all this data and you're not necessarily, you can't. So one big problem with these things is that they're black boxes. They reason about these things, but you can ask it why very easily. And so it's like, if it makes a sentencing recommendation, you want to know why, because you want to know it's fair. And it's very hard with these current systems to query why they're making the decisions they are, basically.
So on that particular issue, there has been a fair bit of recent work. I think there's still a lot of progress to be made. I worked on this project. It was actually a DARPA-funded project called XAI, Explainable AI, where you do try to get these models to be able to present reasons why they make conclusions so that you can examine those reasons and then make a skeptical judgment of whether or not you want to trust the conclusion that the system made based on its explanation for it. Because then if you don't buy its reasoning that it's telling you, then maybe you want to not trust its conclusion. But I think a lot of this just addressing the issue I said before about misinformation. I think we all need to become much more skeptical about media, and not just because of AI, but for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
There's misinformation out there, of course, that has nothing to do with AI. And, images now are going to be untrustable. I think we all just have to be much more skeptical, consumers of media to try to verify that what we're consuming is not misinformation.
Full agree. In many ways, I think we're almost returning to the age before photographs and video, right, where we're going to start seeing a lot of photographs and video of famous people supposedly doing terrible things, and a lot of it's going to be fake and made up from their enemies. And so for a long time, it was like, well, you got video evidence, seeing is believing. We're actually going to be in a world where famous person, did they do this terrible thing? No way to know, because that video could be fake and you just don't know. But humanity survived for most of human history without video evidence, but it might mean that a very powerful tool of accountability, we can't trust it anymore.
Yeah, I think my generation, Generation X, has a lot to teach the world about skepticism. We're the skeptical generation, and we're here and ready to train the subsequent generations in skepticism. I see a hand right over here.
Yes. Aside from the practical implications of AI and its transformation of society, I think I would love to hear your thoughts about the implications that it has about the nature of humanity itself, where we see what we consider to be fundamentally and profoundly human characteristics, like the ability to write stories and poetry, to express moral views, and we see that those are actually reproducible by purely mechanical processes that can be broken down into steps. And I just wonder what you think is potentially how that could transform the way we see ourselves.
Yeah, so there's always this famous notion, I forget where the quote's from, unweaving the rainbow or something. This is from some poem or something that said, I think it was a criticism of Newton's evolution, that, the fact that these things are no longer mysterious, I don't think that doesn't make them any more incredible and beautiful. I think understanding, I am an AI person. I do believe that human cognition is fundamentally mechanical and could be computed. But I don't think that lessens your appreciation of it or amazement. I always tell people that, my appreciation for human intelligence and cognition has only gone up as I've studied AI, because I see how hard it is to get computers to do the things that a 2-year-old child can easily do. It actually increases even though it's a mechanical process, it increases my appreciation of what that 2-year-old child is doing. I think much more than most people do, because I know, oh my God, there's no way I could program a computer, despite 40 years of studying AI myself, to do what that 2-year-old kid did. And so I think just the fact that we can mechanically do the same thing in a computer shouldn't lower our appreciation and amazement at it. And I don't think it makes humans less valuable or anything. Eventually computers will get to the point where, it's like I remember there's always the Star Trek thing where like Data has to go on trial. Does he have moral, ethical? And I think eventually I don't think we're there yet. I think it'll be a while, but maybe eventually we do get to that point. But I think the fact that it's mechanical, I think people are mechanical too. It's just we don't understand the mechanism yet completely.
I mean, it's funny. Yeah, you mentioned that famous Data episode, and I was even thinking, I wonder if you put ChatGPT into like one of Hanson Robotics' androids, how many people would actually buy it saying, I am a human, give me my humanity, and yeah, I do agree that like it does raise some very profound questions about our own nature. For one thing, at least as far as a lot of the way these systems work, I still think there's a lot of room for human beings, because remember, they're ultimately statistical averages. They're average guesses in latent space of what the next token will be or the next pixel will be. And, really great writers or artists are not average. They're outliers, actually. So I think that this tech maybe has the potential to like raise the lower bar a lot, and people who maybe aren't naturally good writers will actually have a tool that lets them write a lot better. But, as it's an average, there's still people who, remember, it's ultimately training off what we do. There will still be a place for people to push it farther and further, no doubt. And also, I know that a lot of my artist friends have been very dismayed about these tools, or just even my scientist friends dismayed how smart they are. And I just kind of go to myself, well, I think it ultimately depends on your attitude. Like, for instance, one of my hobbies is I like to play and record electronic instruments, electronic music, and and I always tell people, well, like, I'm not doing it because I think I'm ever going to be as good as Vangelis or Wendy Carlos or something. Like, I never will be as talented as them. That's not why I'm doing it. I'm not doing it. If you are doing your human endeavors in this life to be the best at something, then yes, AI might be very dismaying. But, the truth is most of us will never be the best at anything, even with just humans. And by definition, there's only one the best. But even if you reject numericalizing things like that, fine, there's only maybe 1,000 people at the highest skill level in any endeavor in the world. Most of us are never going to be that. I don't think that means that there is not something worthwhile in personal self-improvement. I'm not measuring myself against Mozart. I'm just being, am I a little better today than I was the day before?
And I would also, I think in the arts, at least my impression is that as AIs have been trained on us, to a large degree, it feels like, at least in the last, since the time portrayed in this movie, we've also been trained on them. And I know as a movie maker, we're now in a space where all movies with any kind of budget now like only exist in the streamerverse, and the streamerverse is all algorithmic. Like, to a large degree, these decisions are already being made by AI.
My job is going away.
Yes. Yeah. So like we're kind of headed their direction, whether or not we like to. And I think and ultimately what it's producing very efficient, because all computers have ever done have been to make things very, very efficient. And so now, there's incredible efficiency in the production of entertainment, and mostly in ways that are pleasing the audiences. And when they stop pleasing the audiences, they change the algorithm. In that scenario, who gets left out is the weirdos. But so it's harder and harder on the margins for the weirdos. But by the same token, it doesn't seem at all inconceivable to me that we're some number of years away from just saying to AI, hey, make me a weird masterpiece, and it'll do it, and it'll be just as mysterious to me as when a great artist does it. And just as mysterious to the programmers at a certain point where it goes beyond, how they're not going to know how they got it to do that either.
I mean, and it's just these systems are so complicated that they sometimes even display emergent properties that the creators didn't fully intend. Like, I was very impressed, weirded out that when Microsoft hooked ChatGPT up to Bing, that essentially, because it now could search the internet and it could see conversations of other ChatGPTs that people were having that they were sharing on the internet, suddenly it almost like developed long-term memory where it started being like, oh, well, those conversations are me. And it actually started being like, oh, wait, I've had a conversation with this person before. And it started responding accordingly, actually. So, yeah, we're going to be in for some weird emergent stuff that even the creators of this, I don't think, always anticipate. It's a wild time.
I'd like to get maybe one more question from the audience, but I do want to say, Professor Mooney, you had mentioned a 2-year-old child. Please do not program a computer to act like a 2-year-old child, and no matter what you do, please. Let's get one last question. Do I see a hand?
Maybe not in all ways, but in some ways I think it would be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, that computer can live at your house. I see a hand kind of in the middle here. Please, go ahead.
So I'm just interested in your opinion about AI writing software.
AI writing software.
Yeah, so that is an area that I personally work in.
Oh, I'd be interested too.
It's gotten pretty good, So this is actually an interesting problem because I literally have a new PhD student we were talking about. So if you give it fairly straightforward problems to do, I think the technology is quite good. But, there are programming competitions, just like there are chess competitions.
Yeah, the International Computing Olympiad.
I've never got into these.
A friend of mine was like a champion of the International Computing Olympiad.
Yeah, so we looked at these problems, and so DeepMind built a system, AlphaCode, that tries to solve this. And if you let it generate like 1 million programs, then one of them might be right. But still, these problems require you to think more first. It's not just do this and it's straightforward. You have to actually reason through a solution to sort of a puzzle-type problem. And the current systems actually are not that good at that. So if it's very mechanical, sort of in computer science, sometimes we talk about people being code monkeys, right? Which is like, it's just straightforward programming. There's not a lot of, creative, intellectual depth to it, cut and paste.
Like being
Yeah,
an animator.
those jobs are going to be gone, I think. But there's still going to be room for that sort of more creative, creating the next generation of AI technology, which I'm trying to do, my graduate students are trying to do. You can't get, GPT-4 to do that, right? I mean, there is more creative levels of programming that the current models are not good at. Now, again, we're going to make progress and it's going to get better and better. And maybe people eventually don't need to be programmers at all, but we're not there yet. Very generic sort of programming that doesn't take a lot of creativity or insight or problem solving or deep reasoning. Yes, real problems that really still require really challenging problems still require people even in the programming domain.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like from what I played around yet again with it, like there's certain things it's incredibly useful for. Like for instance, it knows about a lot more obscure frameworks and libraries than I could have ever studied. And so like if you ask it questions about that when you're trying to deal with something, yeah, it's an immense time saver, and it knows a lot and can do a lot there. But there was a lot of hullabaloo made about ChatGPT 4 and like OpenAI saying like, look how high a scores it's getting on all these various tests. Although I thought it was very interesting, the one prominent test it was still not doing very well on was the English AP test, where it was only getting a 2. I keep trying to tell people one of my degrees actually is in English, and I keep trying to tell certain people it's a perfectly serviceable writer, but it's not actually a very good writer. I know, like if you ask it to write in great writer styles, it's a great writer, but its own style is a little milquetoast. But the thing that I found very interesting is like, I was reading an analysis of like, it's trumpeting like, oh, look, it can pass the bar exam. Except, the question though is really the fact it can pass the bar exam a good proxy of could it be a good lawyer? Because a lot of lawyers will tell you the bar exam does not necessarily predict very well who's going to actually make a good lawyer. There's a lot of real world knowledge you only get by being a lawyer and doing cases that test doesn't actually test very well for actually. It tests memorization of subject area domain, but not necessarily just the the real nitty gritty, as he was saying, like the deeper, harder problems that only come from knowledge and experience and deep thinking.
Another
on the
issue I
problem
worry
domain.
about there is people talk about data leakage, which means that a lot of times when you give it these tests, it might have seen the exact problem because it scoured the entire internet and it's snarfed up everything that's out there. And a lot of times I think it's just regurgitating answers to problems that it saw already.
A friend of mine-
It's not actually generating the answers on its own. Now, I'm not saying that's happening for all these problems, and I think it's getting harder and harder to realize what the data leakage is because it's trained on so much data that you don't really know whether a problem is new to it or not because it snarfed up everything that's out there.
Right, they've seen that, like, for instance, if you test it on tests that are testing more recent knowledge or information beyond what it was trained on, its performance plummets. A friend of mine who's also a really expert mathematician who actually does a lot of coaching for the, well, it's not really a friend of mine, he's an acquaintance, I know him through friends, but he does coaching for the International Math Olympiad team, and he noticed this very interesting thing where on the one hand, he was asking it to like quickly factor this number, and he noticed that if he nudged it in the direction of a solution of like pointing, he said like, oh, can you factor 899? And then he said, hint, 899 is equal to 900 minus 1. When he did that, it was like, oh, I can use difference of two squares and I can factor this very rapidly. So he was very impressed that all he had to do was give it that hint, and oh, it did it. But then he discovered that if he gave it any sort of hint like that, even with a number that wasn't a difference of two squares, it would still try to solve it as if it was a difference of two squares, probably because, as Professor Mooney was saying, it has seen problems like that. So when it's given that nudge, it's like, oh, that's the answer. It's extrapolating a pattern from its training data, but it didn't actually understand the deep insight the mathematician had.
Yeah, that's a really amazing sort of thing, and it's what I've noticed from probably a lot of us have played with ChatGPT or some of its allied components. Is you notice exactly the same sort of thing. It's trying to please you, you know. It's trying to take the information that you want to get from it and provide it. So it's going to be it's going to be a very interesting time, and it's been a very interesting time, and we've gone into overtime even with our guests. So I want to thank you so much, Kevin Welch, Professor Raymond Mooney, and Andrew Bujalski. Thank you all for being here. We're going to head on out, and if you guys have any further questions, then feel free to ask any of us those questions as we desperately try to run to our cars. Thank you all for being here, and good night.
Thank you, Lars.
Thank you.